Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place you come to get the key knowledge from sources, quickly and in a way that hopefully sticks.
That's the goal.
And today we're doing a really fascinating exploration, I think, into intercessory prayer, specifically within Christian mission. We've got some great source discussions looking at, the history, the biblical roots.
Right, the foundations.
Exactly. And our mission for this deep dive is really to pull out the most important stuff about this practice, how it's seen as, strategic, even transformative.
Yeah, not just wishful thinking.
Right. We want to give you insights that, actually mean something, maybe make a difference in how you see it.
Precisely. And what these sources really hammer home is that intercessory prayer isn't just like a nice spiritual add-on.
Okay.
It's presented as a really powerful, active part of mission. It's got deep roots in Scripture, and, believers have consistently practiced it throughout history.
So it's fundamental.
It's framed as the very breadth of that divine-human connection. Not optional, but a core way God and people interact in these texts.
Okay, let's get right into that foundation then, the biblical basis. You said it's not something that just shows up later.
Not at all. The sources show it woven into the fabric right from the start. Genesis, for example. Abraham's intercession for Sodom and Gomorrah.
Right, the famous story.
And it's powerful. It's not presented as just, Abraham politely asking. It's a bold conversation with God. And it reveals something about God's relational nature, apparently, and the real weight our prayers can carry. It's active engagement.
One of the discussions called it almost like a negotiation with grace. I like that phrase.
That captures it well. It shows this dynamic.
And then there's Moses, Exodus 32, pleading for Israel after the whole golden calf incident.
Right.
What's the key takeaway there for mission today?
Well, what's really illuminating that example, according to these sources, is how Moses' prayer shows that mission isn't just about, our plans and efforts. It's deeply tied to aligning our hearts with God's desire for intervention, for mercy. It's advocating for others.
So it's a partnership again. Our prayers kind of paving the way for God's action.
That's the idea presented. Yeah, a partnership.
And obviously you can't talk about intercession in the Bible without talking about Jesus.
Oh, absolutely central. Jesus Christ is framed as the ultimate intercessor.
His whole life?
His life, his ministry, and especially his sacrifice on the cross, it embodies selfless intercession. And then you look at John 17, that long prayer.
A high priestly prayer, right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Where he prays specifically for his followers and even for those who would believe later.
For us, essentially.
Yeah. It shows this huge scope of his vision for salvation. And it provides a kind of template, really, for mission that depends fundamentally on God's power, not just our own strength.
Okay, so that biblical foundation is really strong. Building on that, let's talk about how this played out historically. The early church, for instance. They didn't just theorize about this, did they?
No, they lived it. That's a crucial point in these discussions. The sources describe the early church as being deeply committed to intercessory prayer.
How so?
They saw it as their lifeline, really, especially when facing persecution, which they obviously did.
Right.
The book of Acts is apparently just full of examples where the community prayed together before major events or decisions.
So it wasn't like a last resort.
Exactly. Not, oh no, things are bad, maybe we should pray. It was often the first step. It led to breakthroughs, open doors, even amidst huge challenges.
So a deliberate strategy.
That's how it's framed, a conscious strategy.
Yeah.
And it ties into their understanding of, spiritual warfare.
Okay, what do the sources mean by spiritual warfare here?
It's generally presented not as like physical fighting, but as recognizing there's unseen opposition to God's work in the world.
Right, forces undermining things.
Yeah, and prayer in that context becomes a primary way to resist those forces, to stand firm, and to align themselves with God's purposes. It's about spiritual resilience and intimacy with God.
You mentioned the Jerusalem church praying before sending out missionaries. That image really stands out.
It does, doesn't it? It shows they recognized, right at the core, that mission success wasn't ultimately down to them.
It required something more.
It required relying on God's intervention, his power, something far beyond just human skill or planning. They knew they were part of something bigger, and prayer connected them to that.
And this wasn't just an early church phenomenon, right? This thread continues.
Absolutely. The sources trace it through history. They mention the medieval period, monastic communities keeping prayer traditions alive.
And
And then the Reformation figures like Calvin and Luther strongly emphasizing prayer's essential role in, advancing God's kingdom and seeking his transformation in the world.
So these historical examples keep reinforcing the idea.
They do. They remind us that mission, at its heart, isn't just about programs or structures. It's fundamentally about connecting with God's power through prayer.
Okay, we've got the biblical roots, the historical practice. Let's unpack the theology a bit more. What are the core ideas behind why intercessory prayer is seen as so important for mission?
A key insight from the sources is the relational aspect. Intercessory prayer isn't just like submitting a request form. It's presented as a dialogue, a genuine conversation with God. And it's built on foundations of trust, humility.
Being willing to ask.
Yeah, and a deep-seated belief in God's power, his omnipotence. When you see it that way, mission gets reframed. It's not our project that we ask God to bless.
It's more collaborative.
Exactly. It's seen as a true partnership with Christ in his ongoing work of redemption. We're participating with him.
And you mentioned spiritual warfare earlier. That seems to be a recurring theme in the theological dimension, too.
Yes, it is. The sources connect intercessory prayer directly to engaging in this spiritual struggle.
How so?
Against forces, principalities, powers, language drawn often from Ephesians 6 forces that actively work against God's redemptive purposes.
Like pushing back against negativity or opposition.
Kind of. Intentional prayer is framed as a vital form of spiritual resistance. It's part of putting on that spiritual armor alongside other mission activities like evangelism. It equips believers.
This is a really rich picture, biblical, historical, theological. So the big question then becomes, how do we actually do this today? How does this translate into practical mission work?
Right, the so what question. And the sources offer some very concrete ideas here.
Good.
One major theme is integrating prayer into the daily rhythm of mission strategy. Not just having a prayer meeting once a week.
But weaving it in.
Yeah, intentionally building moments of prayer into team meetings, into planning sessions, into outreach preparation, into discipleship. The goal is to make sure decisions are guided by listening to God, not just
a cornerstone, like you said, not just the spiritual decoration.
Exactly. And beyond that, the discussion suggests things like setting up regular prayer circles or specific intercessory teams.
Dedicated.
Yes, groups that partner intentionally with mission leaders or specific projects, providing focused, consistent prayer support.
Okay.
But it's also about cultivating a broader culture of intercession, moving beyond just formal structures.
How do you do that?
By nurturing personal dependence on God, maybe through training, sharing testimonies. Stories of answered prayer are powerful, and creating spaces for collective prayer gatherings.
One of the sources mentioned a specific example, a prayer partnership program.
Yes, that was a great illustration. A program in, I think it was a diverse urban setting, where local believers connected digitally with global mission teams for daily prayer. It shows how technology can actually facilitate this kind of partnership and build unity across distances.
That's really practical, but then there's the challenge. How do you measure the impact of prayer? It's not always obvious, is it?
No, it's definitely not like tracking website clicks or something. That's a key challenge highlighted.
So what do the sources suggest?
They really stress looking beyond the purely tangible outcomes. Number of converts, buildings built, programs run.
Important, but not the whole picture.
Right. We're encouraged to also value the often unseen things, shifts in people's hearts, quiet transformations, reconciliation, spiritual growth. These are impacts of prayer, too.
So how do you track that?
Well, suggestions include incorporating more reflective practices, like spiritual assessments within teams or intentionally sharing stories, testimonies of how prayer has made a tangible difference in situations of people's lives.
Capturing the qualitative side.
Exactly. And maybe developing frameworks that try to track both the measurable milestones and these more qualitative spiritual markers. It requires a broader view of success.
It keeps coming back to this idea in the discussions prayer as the unseen engine of mission. I find that image really compelling.
It is compelling, isn't it? Like something working powerfully beneath the surface, making everything else possible.
Yeah.
And the sources really lean into that. They reiterate how figures like Abraham and Moses stepped into that gap, that divine dialogue, responding to brokenness by engaging proactively with God.
Not just accepting things as they were.
Right. And Jesus' prayer in John 17 is held up again as the ultimate example of selfless intercession, aligning the divine will with the plan for salvation.
And the early church.
Their communal prayer life is described almost as the birthplace of their power. where deliverance happened, where they found boldness to witness. Even later, monastic traditions, the reformers, they all recognized prayer as fundamental, the heartbeat, you could say.
It's like this continuous thread, this vital sign throughout history.
Precisely. Prayer is framed as the conduit for divine intervention, the way believers get drawn into this dynamic relationship with God, aligning their wills with his plans.
And the spiritual warfare aspect again.
Yes, it's also consistently framed as a weapon in that spiritual struggle against forces opposing God's kingdom.
So the practical takeaway for today is,
It's about embedding prayer everywhere. Dedicated teams, yes, but also integrating it into planning, into the very culture of mission organizations, fostering dependence on God, sharing the stories. And then, when measuring impact, broadening the lens to see those qualitative shifts, healed relationships, empowered witnesses, renewed hope as real evidence of prayer at work.
the sources also dive deeper into some of these key biblical stories, like Abraham and Sodom. It's treated as more than just an ancient tale.
Oh, definitely. It's presented as a profound case study, really, into divine justice and mercy, revealing the heart of intercession.
So the context is crucial. Sodom facing destruction.
Right. It underscores the seriousness of judgment, but also God's desire for redemption, which is why he engages with Abraham.
And Abraham's approach, humble but bold.
Exactly. He approaches God respectfully, but he's persistent. He dialogues. It shows intercession as an act of faith, not presumption.
And that negotiation
Right.
down to 10 righteous people.
Yeah, that progressive lowering of the bar, it's fascinating. It reveals, according to these sources, how much God values even a small flicker of righteousness.
Balancing holiness and mercy.
That's the theological core. How does God maintain his justice and extend his mercy? Intercessory prayer operates right in that tension. And the plea highlights the potential impact of just one righteous person.
So real-world applications. Persistent prayer, embracing that tension of justice and grace.
Yes, cultivating that persistence in our communities and wrestling with that paradox in our own lives, even in how we approach social justice issues.
It's powerful. And Abraham's prayer isn't just about the outcome, it's about him, his character, isn't it? Empathy, boldness, persistence.
That's another layer the sources explore. It's a portrait of a heart aligned with God. His empathy for Sodom, identifying with a potential loss, challenges us to connect with needs beyond our immediate bubble.
Like leaders understanding marginalized communities today.
Could be, yeah. Then there's his boldness balanced with reverence. He speaks confidently to God, but always as God. It invites us into that kind of faithful conversation.
And his persistence is remarkable. He just keeps going.
He does. It encourages us not to give up easily in prayer, seeing perseverance itself as an act of faith. It translates to sustained effort, maybe through regular prayer meetings or community support networks.
And again, that justice and mercy balance.
Yes, respecting God's holiness regarding sin, but always aspiring towards his grace. Super relevant for anyone grappling with injustice or moral decline today.
And the punchline, of course, is that Lot's family is spared.
Right. It's shown as a direct result of Abraham's intercession. A crucial reminder that our prayers aren't just, empty words sent into the void. They are heard. They matter.
Let's shift to Nehemiah, another key figure the sources highlight for his prayerful leadership.
Yes. Nehemiah is presented as a fantastic example of prayer underpinning bold, decisive action.
What's the first thing he does when he hears about Jerusalem?
He doesn't immediately draw up plans or rally troops. His first response is weeping, mourning, fasting, and praying for days.
Prayer first, not last resort.
Exactly. It positions prayer as the engine, the starting point for mission and leadership, not just something you do when your plans fail. It's born from burden, from that connection with God's heart for the situation.
And the content of his prayer is significant too, isn't it? It's not just, help us, God.
No, it's structured, it's thoughtful. He starts with confession, identifying with his people's sin, not just pointing fingers. That's a call for leaders to own the brokenness.
Taking responsibility.
Then he remembers God's promises.
Yeah.
He roots his requests in God's own character and covenant faithfulness. That encourages us to pray Scripture back to God.
Praying promises.
Exactly. And his petition is specific. Give me success today. Grant me favor in the presence of this man, the king. Clarity in prayer leads to clarity in vision.
He also knew the situation right. It was informed prayer.
Absolutely. His prayer flowed from understanding the political, spiritual, social realities. Informed prayer is impactful prayer. It requires listening, research, empathy.
And boldness. Asking to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem was a huge ask.
Huge. It shows intercession stretches our faith, pushes us to ask for the seemingly impossible, urging leaders to pray bigger, bolder prayers.
So for Nehemiah, prayer wasn't separate from action.
Not at all. It was the catalyst. Prayer launched the mission, and it seems prayer and planning were integrated throughout the whole rebuilding process. It sustained the work.
Okay, let's move into the New Testament community, the early church. The sources paint a picture of a church really advancing on its knees.
They do. Amidst intense pressure, Roman oppression, persecution prayer is described as their lifeblood, the bloodstream of their mission.
And the story of Peter in prison in Acts 12 is a prime example.
A classic example. The church prays earnestly, persistently for him. It's shown as communal action, not just individual pleas.
And the result is miraculous.
Right, Peter is freed by an angel. And interestingly, the believers are initially incredulous when he shows up.
Huh. Yeah, Rhoda leaves him standing at the door.
It shows God answers prayer, even when our faith is maybe a bit shaky or imperfect. He responds to that corporate desperation.
And Paul, the great missionary apostle, he asked for prayer too.
Constantly. That's another key point. Here's this giant of the faith with clear apostolic authority, yet he repeatedly asks the churches to pray for him.
Why?
It highlights his dependence, both on God and on his fellow believers. He understood mission as spiritual warfare, and he knew he needed divine power and the prayer support of the church.
He saw prayer as participation.
Yes. Look at his specific requests in letters like Romans, Ephesians, Colossians. He asks for boldness, open doors, protection, clarity in his message. He saw the prayers of the churches as actively contributing to his work. They were joining him in the struggle.
So the whole spiritual environment, the ecology, as one source put it, was prayer-soaked.
Absolutely. Acts 1, 2, 13, 16 prayer precedes major moments. Waiting for the Spirit, choosing leaders, sending missionaries, breaking into new regions, prayer was the missional infrastructure.
Which poses questions for us today, doesn't it? Do we send people out with that kind of prayer backing?
Crucial questions. Do we have robust prayer infrastructures supporting our mission efforts?
And that idea of partnership really comes through with Paul. Join me in my struggle, sunagonizomai.
Right, that Greek word implies intense effort, like striving together in an athletic contest or a battle. He saw his prayer partners in the churches back home as fellow soldiers fighting alongside him.
So praying for missionaries isn't just passive support.
Not according to Paul. It's active participation. It builds bonds, transforms distant names on a list into beloved co-laborers. It's a spiritual supply chain, essential for the front lines.
So Paul models this relational dependency, this partnership. It disrupts the idea of the lone hero missionary.
Totally. Despite his calling and gifts, he admits his need for God and for his people's spiritual reinforcement. That's profound humility.
And the specificity of his requests is important too, not just bless Paul.
Yes, he asks for specific things needed for specific situations. Boldness in Ephesus, rescue from opponents in Thessalonica. Strategic intercession requires awareness of the context. Prayer is most powerful when it's precise.
And back to the corporate prayer, Acts 12 again. Praying together seems to amplify things.
The sources suggest it does. There's a sense that communal prayer, that united hunger for God's intervention, has an exponential impact. It magnifies faith.
Like a missional ecosystem, covering all the bases.
Yeah, praying for protection, provision, bold proclamation, perseverance. Holistic prayer for the missionary's well-being and the mission's success.
Okay, let's focus on that collective power. Acts 12, Peter's release. What makes corporate prayer so potent according to these texts?
Well, there's strength in unity, right? Jesus himself said, "Where 2 or 3 gather in my name, there am I with them."
Matthew 18.20.
Right. There's a sense that unity multiplies the spiritual force. The early church is shown acting as one praying organism. Prayer was their heartbeat, their first response, their weapon.
Especially in response to persecution. Acts 4, after Peter and John are threatened.
Yes, in Acts 12. Their response wasn't primarily political maneuvering or panic. It was spiritual resistance through united prayer. Historically, persecution often fuels deeper intercession.
And it leads to breakthroughs. Peter's release is the dramatic example.
Exactly. It's presented as being directly triggered by the church's fervent, united prayer. That initial disbelief we mentioned just highlights God's grace. He answers even imperfect, desperate faith.
So the implication for us is to reclaim that power of we.
Yes, in a culture often focused on the individual me, the church is called to be this intercessory ecosystem.
How can churches reignite that today?
The sources suggest making corporate prayer central, not peripheral, making it specific and informed, making it inclusive, and maybe even using times of crisis, not as reasons to stop praying together, but as catalysts to pray more fervently.
So Drawing all these threads together, Abraham, Nehemiah, Paul, the early church, what are the timeless blueprints for mission strategy today?
The core message is, intercession isn't an optional extra. It's the first strategy, the foundation. Abraham teaches us discernment, empathy, identifying with the lost. Nehemiah shows leadership rooted in prayer that's informed by context and leads directly to action. It's continuous.
Right.
The early church demonstrates the power of collective intercession, unity unlocking breakthrough, prayer as spiritual warfare fought together.
And Paul?
Paul highlights partnership. Prayer supporters aren't on the sidelines, they're co-laborers. Gifted apostles needed that support.
So implementing this means?
Recentering prayer in our structures, developing prayerful discernment, a prayer lens for strategy, maybe even normalizing the language of spiritual warfare, understanding there's opposition.
And leadership itself needs that prayer foundation. Nehemiah again.
Absolutely. Leadership starts on its knees. It's about getting the burden from God before drafting the blueprint. Communion with God, shaping the consultation.
And Nehemiah's prayer structure confession, covenant recall, specific requests, that's a model.
It's presented as a strategic layering. Owning sin, claiming promises, asking clearly. Prayer precedes action, sustains action. Presence before performance.
How does this translate into modern movements?
It means seeing mission leaders as intercessory architects, redefining success beyond just numbers to include heart restoration, balancing our strategic planning with a posture of deep spiritual dependence.
And mobilizing those prayer networks you mentioned earlier, that seems crucial for translating individual prayer into collective force.
It is. Prayer is the engine room, often underestimated. The early church praying for Peter is the model, communal, targeted, urgent, persistent. That's partnership.
Why do we overlook it sometimes?
Maybe our efficiency culture? Sometimes prayer feels slow. Or transactional support models just sending money. Maybe a lack of vision for prayer's power.
So mobilizing networks is timeless.
It needs structure. Someone coordinating. Clear communication channels for needs. Frontline intel, feedback loop, sharing answers, and focus. Specific prayer points.
Can you give an example?
Imagine churches adopting unreached people groups not just financially but spiritually with dedicated prayer teams, or mission agencies assigning prayer teams to specific projects or missionaries like Antioch did.
And the ripple effect?
Spiritual covering, protection for workers, divine acceleration, things happening that wouldn't otherwise, and deepening the partnership across the global church. It's a call to make intercession truly strategic. Audit our prayer strategies, train intercessors, tell the stories.
So distilling the lessons. Cultivate Abraham's heart of compassion. Integrate prayer into leadership like Nehemiah. Foster collective movements like the early church. Recognize partnership like Paul.
And pray boldly like Abraham, persistently. Pray specifically and strategically like Paul and Nehemiah, grounded in context, aligned with God's kingdom goals. These are the blueprints.
Now, how has our understanding of intercessory prayer evolved from those early church practices to today's complex mission contexts? The principle seems enduring, but maybe the practice changes.
That's a great question. The sources suggest the core principle, dependent connection with God, remains, but the expression evolves.
How was it in the early church?
Characterized by corporate dependency, urgent expectancy, often a very localized focus. It was raw, immediate, the engine driving local gospel advance against visible opposition.
And as the church expanded globally,
Prayer also became more global, more strategic. Paul's mission-focused intercession, his awareness of spiritual opposition across regions that shows an expansion.
and today, modern mission.
We see global prayer movements, technology connecting intercessors worldwide, strategic targeting of prayer towards specific issues or unreached groups, virtual prayer communities. The scope and potential responsibility have arguably expanded enormously.
Are there cautions with this evolution?
Yes, the sources warn against losing the heart. Prayer becoming mere ritual, or trying to manipulate God, or over-relying on technology and losing the relational core. Prayer must remain communion.
So returning to the core.
Exactly. Reclaiming intercession as intimacy presence, listening, as advocacy bearing the burdens of others, as spiritual warfare resisting the enemy, and as strategy shaping decisions through seeking God's wisdom.
So the vision is?
A church that prays with the passion and dependence of the early church, but plans and connects with the tools and understanding we have today. Every missionary surrounded by prayer, every strategy birthed in prayer.
How does this shape our understanding of effective prayer and mission now, moving beyond just asking for blessing?
Right. It's about recognizing the spiritual warfare dimension more intentionally, not being naive about opposition, praying with authority against spiritual strongholds hindering the mission, praying strategically, not just generally.
And listening becomes key.
Crucial. Prayer as a two-way conversation, seeking God's direction, his perspective, like the early church did before sending Paul and Barnabas, or Paul seeking guidance on where to go. Less talking at God, more listening with God.
And that idea of identification, empathy.
Yes, interceding with empathy, truly identifying with the pain, the struggles, the needs of those we're praying for, like Abraham did for Sodom or Paul did for the churches. It requires relational investment, not just praying for categories of people. It also implies a humility.
A humility of dependence.
Exactly. Acknowledging we don't have all the answers, that we genuinely need God's intervention and wisdom, and we need each other's support and prayer. That disrupts any sense of self-sufficiency in mission.
This has been a really thorough deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from Abraham right through to modern applications.
Yeah.
The core message seems crystal clear. Intercessory prayer isn't secondary. It's presented in these sources as a powerful, strategic, foundational force in Christian mission.
Absolutely. Not passive wishing, but active, vital engagement with God, deeply rooted in the Bible and church history.
It's been great unpacking this, getting that structured overview, but also those memorable stories and details. Hopefully that's helpful for everyone listening.
It underscores that this is seen as an essential component of mission strategy, not just a spiritual discipline disconnected from the work itself.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening to mull over. Considering this weight of biblical and historical emphasis, how might a more intentional, maybe more strategic commitment to intercessory prayer change your own understanding or your engagement with mission?
Yeah, whether that's locally in your community or thinking about global issues.
How could you or we tap into what these sources call these deep reservoirs of hope, resilience, and collective wisdom through prayer? Something to reflect on.
Definitely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.